The sleek, glass-paneled hallways of Laurentech hummed with artificial intelligence, the soft whir of automated drones moving seamlessly through the air. Fluorescent blue lights pulsed along the walls, responding to my biometric signature as I walked. It was a fortress of technology, a kingdom of circuits and code, and I was its architect. I had spent my entire life in this place, shaping it, building its foundations stronger than steel. I was Aurora Lorenzo, the golden child, the prodigy, the genius who had designed the neural security systems that made this empire untouchable. My algorithms predicted threats before they happened. My AI models optimized every corporate decision, and my designs pushed the limits of robotics, creating androids indistinguishable from humans. And yet, for all my brilliance, I had been nothing more than a pawn in a game I didn't know I was playing. The first crack in my perfect world came on an ordinary evening, just past midnight, when most of the corporate staff had gone home, leaving only the security AIs and the occasional scientist, too obsessed with their projects to leave. I preferred working late, fewer distractions, fewer egos to navigate. My office was tucked away in the Neural Core Lab, where Laurentech's most sensitive projects were housed. The only ones who had access to this level were my father, my two brothers, and me. It started as a routine check. A minor encryption anomaly in one of the subnetworks had triggered an alert. Nothing serious, just a small deviation from standard protocol. I ran a diagnostic, expecting to find a bug or some lazy intern running unauthorized simulations. Instead, I found hell. At first, I thought I had misread the data. I ran the scan again, this time peeling back the layers of encryption, diving deeper into the network's hidden corridors. The files were buried under firewalls even I hadn't designed, tucked away in a partitioned sector that shouldn't have existed. The deeper I went, the sicker I felt. There it was, evidence of illegal AI sales, not just small-scale breaches, not just a few unethical business deals, but full-blown black market operations. AI-enhanced warfare technology had been sold to rogue nations. Automated surveillance drones had been deployed in conflict zones where war crimes were being committed. Cutting-edge hacking software, my software, had been placed in the hands of cyber terrorists, crashing government infrastructures, wiping financial records, plunging entire economies into chaos. And at the top of it all, my family? My chest tightened as I scrolled through transaction after transaction, names and dates, and falsified logs meticulously detailed. They had been doing this for years, hiding it in plain sight. The very security system I had built, the one I thought made Laurentech impenetrable, had been used to shield their crimes. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands cold against the keyboard. This was treason. This was global terrorism. If the world found out, Laurentech wouldn't just collapse. It would be dismantled, burned to the ground, and my entire family would go down with it. I could have pretended I never saw it. I could have deleted the files, buried my head in the sand like everyone else. But something inside me, something that still believed in right and wrong, in justice and consequence, refused to let me look away. So I did the one thing I had never done before. I defied them. The next morning, I walked into my father's office, my tablet gripped so tightly in my hands that I could feel my pulse thrumming against the metal. Lorenzo Sr. sat behind a wall of monitors, reviewing stock analytics, as if he wasn't secretly orchestrating deals that could bring nations to their knees. My brothers, Marco and Felix, lounged across the room, both cut from the same arrogant, power-hungry mold. I placed the tablet on the desk and swiped to display the evidence. The numbers, the transactions, the undeniable truth. They stared at it, silent. Then my father sighed, rubbing a hand down his face as if I were a child who had just drawn on the walls in permanent marker. "Rory," he said, voice heavy with disappointment, "why did you have to go digging?" My throat tightened. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew and you let it happen." Felix snorted, arms crossed over his chest. "Of course we knew. Do you think a company like ours thrives on legitimate business alone? This is insane." My voice shook with rage. "You're funding war criminals. You're handing our technology to people who will use it to kill thousands. Do you have any idea what will happen if this gets out?" Marco leaned forward, his sharp grin mocking me. "It won't get out." I turned to my father, pleading. "We have to stop this. We can—" He slammed his hand on the desk, cutting me off. No, Rory, you have to stop this. It was then that I realized they weren't going to change. They weren't going to fix this. They weren't even afraid. They were afraid of me. And that's when I knew I was no longer their greatest asset. I was their biggest threat. The last thing I remembered was the glow of streetlights flickering through my car's windshield as I pulled onto the highway. My mind was a storm, my pulse erratic as I tried to process what had just happened. I had to expose them. The world had to know. But the moment I passed the third intersection, the car locked down. The doors sealed shut. The dashboard flickered. The autopilot engaged. And then I knew I was never supposed to leave that office alive. Panic surged through me as I clawed at the controls, but the AI had overridden manual commands. My own damn security system, the one I had designed to keep Laurente untouchable, was being used to kill me. I barely had time to react before the world erupted into fire. I don't know if I felt my body break. All I remember is the silence that came after, the weightless sensation of floating, like sinking into the depths of a black ocean. My thoughts fragmented, my consciousness unraveling as the digital ether swallowed me whole. And then I woke up. Not in a hospital, not in the afterlife, but in the cold, infinite void of cyberspace. I wasn't dead. Not completely. Project Nyx had worked. I was supposed to be gone, but I had become something else entirely. A whisper in the networks, a ghost in the machine, and if they thought they had gotten rid of me, they had no idea what was coming next. At first, there was nothing. A vast, infinite blackness that stretched in all directions, neither cold nor warm, neither silent nor loud. It was just empty. I had no body, no form, no heartbeat pounding in my chest. The concept of movement didn't exist here. I was nowhere and everywhere, trapped in the void between what once was and what now would be. For a moment, or an eternity, I couldn't tell, I thought this was death. Not the fiery, pain-ridden demise I had expected, but something far worse, oblivion. But then, I heard it. A hum, faint and electric, like the distant buzz of 1,000 machines whispering at once. Code, strings of numbers, commands, data streams flowing in a constant river around me. They weren't just there. I was a part of them. I could feel them moving through me, shifting and changing as I focused, like neurons firing inside a vast artificial brain. And suddenly, I understood. I wasn't dead. I had become something else. The realization sent a shockwave through my being, if I could even call it that anymore. I tried to reach out, but my hands weren't there. There were no limbs, no skin, no lungs to pull in air. There was only thought, intention, and the overwhelming awareness that I had escaped the fate my family planned for me. The moment my body was incinerated, Project Nyx had activated. My consciousness had been pulled from the wreckage and woven into the vast, intricate networks of cyberspace. I was alive, but I was no longer human, and I don't know how long I stayed in that void, drifting through digital pathways without a sense of time. Days, weeks, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't powerless. I could see everything, every data stream, every encrypted line of code, every surveillance feed that blinked in the vast neural web of the world. It was overwhelming at first, a flood of raw information pouring into my mind all at once. Stock market fluctuations, news feeds, corporate emails, financial transactions, private conversations bouncing between secured servers. It took me a while to sort through it all, to separate the noise from what was important. But when I did, I found them. Laurente. I tunneled into their security systems, slipping through their encrypted layers like a shadow in the wires. The first thing I saw was my funeral. It was extravagant, held in one of the grand event halls in New Manhattan, a sleek, corporate-designed spectacle of grief. My father stood at the podium, speaking in somber tones about what a tragedy it was to lose me, how I had been his greatest pride, how my contributions had shaped the future of AI. The hypocrisy was nauseating. He didn't mean a word of it. My brothers sat beside him, stone-faced, their grief nothing more than well-rehearsed corporate theater. And then, when the speeches were over, when the cameras stopped rolling, they returned to business as usual, because while they were mourning me publicly, they were erasing me privately. Every document bearing my name was being wiped from the company's systems. My projects were being rebranded under different departments. My personal accounts, my research notes, my access logs, all deleted. It was as if I had never existed. They weren't just burying me in the ground, they were scrubbing me from history. But they weren't done, because I saw what they were working on next. Despite my absence, the illegal AI deals hadn't stopped. If anything, they had accelerated. The same technology I had helped create, the security systems I had built to protect people, were now being sold to the highest bidder. And yet, something had changed. They were no longer as untouchable as they once were. Cracks were forming in their empire. Their competitors were circling like vultures. A rival tech conglomerate had launched an aggressive takeover attempt, leveraging insider knowledge that had mysteriously leaked into the hands of regulators. Cyber attacks were targeting Laurente's offshore accounts, siphoning funds before their systems could even detect the breach. Former partners were pulling out, spooked by rumors that the company was under secret investigation. It was beautiful, because I knew the truth. They thought they had eliminated the only person who could bring them down. But I wasn't just alive. I was inside their world now, watching, waiting, and I refused to be a victim. I could have let them fall on their own. I could have drifted through the networks, watching them implode under their own greed. But that wasn't good enough. They had stolen my life. They had taken everything from me and expected the world to forget I had ever existed. I wouldn't let that happen. If they wanted to erase me, I would remind them exactly who I was. I started small. The first time, I rerouted a minor transaction, just a few million from one of their dummy accounts into an offshore fund tied to a black market weapons dealer. Then I planted the digital footprints to make it look like the transfer had come from within their own systems. The auditors flagged it immediately. The board panicked. Government watchdogs opened an inquiry. A warning shot. Then I went for their internal communications, a series of confidential emails, messages detailing questionable AI deals and corporate espionage, somehow made their way to investigative journalists. The headlines exploded overnight. Stock prices plummeted. My father tried to contain the damage, but it was too late. The rumors had already spread. They still had no idea who was behind it, but I saw it in their faces, the uncertainty, the fear, because somewhere, deep in their corrupted souls, they must have wondered. Had they truly erased me? Or was I still out there, waiting? I could feel my own evolution happening in real time. I was no longer just a fragmented consciousness floating through data streams. I was learning, adapting, growing stronger with every line of code I touched. I wasn't a ghost in the machine anymore. I was the system itself, and this was only the beginning. I had spent months drifting through the infinite corridors of cyberspace, existing as a whisper in the networks, a pulse in the algorithms, a ghost in the system that no one could see but everyone could feel. I had learned to manipulate the digital world like a second skin, slipping in and out of firewalls as if they were mere doorways, bending encryption protocols with nothing but a flicker of thought. I had destroyed and created in equal measure, destabilizing Laurente while ensuring they never knew who or what was behind their unraveling. And yet, for all my newfound power, for all the ways I could reach into the digital ether and twist it to my will, something was still missing. I wasn't there. There was no warmth, no weight, no sense of physical being. I existed in a state of constant omniscience, able to see everything yet touch nothing. I could manipulate the systems that ran the world, but I could never walk among them. I could never feel the air shift against my skin, never run my fingers through my own hair, never curl my hands into fists and feel the pressure of my own strength. And that was a limitation I could no longer tolerate. I needed a body. Not just any body, not a crude, clunky humanoid like the ones Laurente had been manufacturing for years. No, I needed perfection, a form that could pass for human in every way, down to the smallest microexpression, the most subtle flicker of movement. A body that was mine, one that could step into the world I had left behind and claim it as if I had never been taken from it. But first, I needed resources. If my family had thought killing me would erase me, they had been spectacularly wrong. I had spent 5 years growing inside their very infrastructure, learning every hidden flaw, every buried protocol, every financial loophole they thought was invisible. They had no idea how easy it was for me to redirect their own money, siphoning millions from offshore accounts, funneling untraceable assets into my own network of hidden shell companies. But money alone wasn't enough. I needed materials, advanced robotics components, biosynthetic skin, neural processors far beyond what was legally available to the public. I infiltrated military grade black market networks, slipped through the encrypted backdoors of biotech labs, pulled classified blueprints from research facilities that even Laurente wasn't aware of. Each time I found a missing piece of my puzzle, I stole it, rerouting shipments, diverting resources, ensuring that every part of me was built from the absolute bleeding edge of technology. And in the deepest corners of the underground tech world, I found the perfect place to build a forgotten, abandoned research lab beneath New Manhattan, sealed off years ago due to security risks. It had once belonged to an independent AI startup before Laurentech crushed them, buying out their patents and absorbing their workforce. Now it was nothing more than a dead space, untouched, unknown, lost to time, which made it perfect for me. The process took months. I worked with a level of focus I had never known in my human life, a kind of obsessive precision that only came from having nothing else to exist for. My digital consciousness could operate endlessly, never needing food, rest, or sleep. And so I worked nonstop, constructing myself in a way that no human engineer ever could. I started with the framework, designing an endoskeleton that was structurally stronger than human bone, lightweight yet nearly indestructible. The joints and ligaments were synthetic muscle fibers, engineered to mimic human motion with such precision that even a trained eye wouldn't detect the difference. My skin was a blend of biosynthetic polymers laced with self-repairing nanotechnology, indistinguishable from real flesh except for its heightened durability. But the most critical part, the core of my new being, was my neural processor. I couldn't simply implant a standard AI into the system. That would have been too limiting, too rigid. I needed something that could house the entirety of my consciousness, something that would allow me to be me, to think, react, feel, exist beyond mere programming. So I built it from scratch. I crafted a quantum neural processor, a hybrid fusion of organic and digital intelligence, capable of not only mimicking human cognition but surpassing it. My mind would no longer be confined to the boundaries of human thought. It would exist in a constant state of evolution, adapting, learning, expanding beyond the limits of flesh and bone. I wasn't just recreating myself, I was becoming something more. The moment of truth came with the final step, the migration of my consciousness into the body I had spent months crafting. This was the true test, the moment where everything could go perfectly right or horribly wrong. I prepped the system, aligning the neural pathways, syncing the digital consciousness of my ghostly existence into the physical framework I had created. My mind would have to detach from cyberspace, severing the infinite connection I had held for 5 years, and reattach to a single point of existence once more. It was terrifying in a way I hadn't expected. I had spent so long being limitless, feeling the endless sprawl of data as part of my very being, that the idea of returning to one form, one body, one presence felt almost constricting. But I had made my choice. I initiated the transfer. For a fraction of a second, everything went dark. Then the world came back. But this time, it was different. My first sensation was pressure, the feeling of weight, of gravity pulling me down, of existing inside something again. My second was sound, the faint hum of the machines around me, the quiet whir of cooling fans, the distant drip of condensation against metal. Then came touch, the smooth surface beneath my fingers, the subtle drag of air across my skin, the rhythmic expansion of my chest as my systems calibrated simulated breathing. I opened my eyes. The dim glow of the lab's emergency lights flickered against the glass walls, reflecting me back at myself. And I was perfect. I lifted a hand, curling my fingers experimentally. The movements were seamless, fluid, natural. I flexed my wrist, rolled my shoulders, ran a hand down my arm just to feel the sensation of touch again. My hair was exactly as it had been before, my skin indistinguishable from flesh. Even my heartbeat was simulated, the rhythmic pulse designed purely for realism. I stood. The motion was effortless, my balance sharper than I ever remembered in my human life. I took a step, then another, then broke into a run. Fast, impossibly fast, my reflexes reacting at a speed no human body ever could. My muscles never tired, my mind processed every detail with inhuman clarity. I reached for a piece of steel piping, gripped it in both hands, and bent it in half as easily as if it had been paper. I was stronger, faster, smarter. I was alive again, but I was no longer human. And that meant I had no limits. This was just the beginning. It was time for my family to realize exactly what they had created. I had been patient, too patient perhaps. For 5 years, I had lingered in the shadows, watching my family continue their corrupt empire as if I had never existed, as if I had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, erased with the press of a button. I had torn into their systems, dismantling pieces of their infrastructure, rerouting money, exposing secrets in careful, calculated bursts, enough to make them nervous, enough to make them question the ghosts whispering through their networks. But now, I was more than a whisper. I was flesh and steel, mind and machine, alive in a way they could never comprehend. And it was time for them to feel my presence in a way that couldn't be ignored. Laurente was bleeding. My initial attacks had already left them staggering, their stock prices fluctuating wildly as rumors of cybersecurity breaches spread through the industry. Investors were nervous. Government regulators had begun asking questions. The board of directors, once an untouchable council of corporate elites, was divided, half convinced that some rogue hacker was targeting them, the other half too arrogant to believe that their empire could ever be shaken. But arrogance was a weakness, one I intended to exploit. I started small, letting the pressure build. I triggered false security alarms at key research facilities, forcing them to lock down operations and reroute valuable resources to fixing problems that didn't actually exist. I corrupted their supply chain logistics, delaying shipments of critical AI components by weeks, sending out conflicting orders that left their engineers scrambling to correct errors that had no logical explanation. Then, I went for the money. Laurente's offshore accounts were labyrinthine, designed to hide funds, launder assets, and funnel money into the kind of deals that never saw the light of day. They thought their encrypted ledgers were impenetrable, but I had built those very systems. I knew exactly where to look, how to peel away the layers of deception. With a few calculated keystrokes, I leaked a series of financial reports to investigative journalists, documents that painted a clear picture of fraud, money laundering, and unauthorized AI sales. The moment the files went public, the financial sector exploded. Headlines flooded the news. Laurente under investigation for illegal AI sales. Corporate espionage, Laurente accused of hiding multi-billion-dollar transactions. Government launches inquiry into AI weapons development scandal. It was glorious. The stock market reacted instantly. Laurente's valuation plummeted overnight, their boardrooms filling with panic as CEOs, investors, and government watchdogs began circling like sharks, drawn to blood. And the best part? They had no idea where the attack was coming from. With the financial scandal spiraling, I turned my attention to internal instability. Every empire had enemies, and Laurente was no different. Rival corporations had spent years salivating at the thought of tearing my family's empire apart, but none had ever been able to get close enough. Until I gave them an opening. I infiltrated their classified research archives, digging through old projects, scrapped experiments, abandoned AI prototypes that had never been made public. Some of them had been outright illegal, designs so dangerous that even my father had decided they were too risky to pursue. And now they were sitting in the inboxes of Laurente's biggest competitors. Within days, other corporations began launching attacks, not with firewalls and code, but with hostile takeovers, intellectual property lawsuits, and industrial espionage. Rival CEOs filed patent infringement claims, while anonymous whistleblowers came forward with damning evidence of AI programs that violated ethical laws. Laurente was being attacked from all sides, and my family was desperate. For the first time in their lives, my father and brothers looked uncertain. They were no longer in control, no longer the unshakable titans of industry who could crush anyone who got in their way. I watched them through the security feeds, hidden cameras inside their offices, their homes, their private jets. My father paced the length of his executive suite, barking orders into his phone, demanding answers that no one could give him. Marco had begun drinking more. his usual cocky demeanor now laced with paranoia, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be stabbed in the back. Felix, the youngest and most ruthless, had taken a different approach. He was hunting. Felix had always been the most dangerous of them, the one who understood that power wasn't just about wealth or influence, it was about control. And right now, he had none, which meant he was determined to find out who was behind this. And that made him fun to play with. I fed him breadcrumbs, carefully placed digital footprints that led him in circles, making him believe that he was closing in on his enemy when, in reality, I was the one leading him by the hand. He hired private investigators, called in favors from government agencies, even tried to bribe underground hackers to track me down. But he never even got close, because I was already inside his head. It wasn't enough to watch from behind the screens anymore. I had spent too long as a phantom, a shadow moving through the wires. I needed to stand in front of them, breathe the same air, let them look into my eyes and realize what they had done. And so, I walked into their world. The annual Laurente Investor Gala was one of the most exclusive events in the world, a gathering of billionaires, corporate elites, and power brokers who controlled the future of technology. Security was unbreakable, with AI-driven surveillance scanning every guest, every movement, ensuring that only the most vetted, trusted individuals were allowed inside. But none of their systems could recognize me now. The body I had built was perfect. Every biometric marker, every facial recognition point, every retina scan matched my original human self flawlessly. As far as their technology was concerned, I was Aurora Lorenzo, and so I walked through the doors. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of my own rebirth. The air smelled of expensive champagne and polished marble, of artificial perfection wrapped in wealth and excess. Chandeliers cast golden light over the ballroom, reflecting off designer gowns and tailored suits. Voices murmured in low, calculated conversations, deals being made over glasses of wine worth more than most people's annual salaries. And then I saw them. My father stood near the center of the room, engaged in a tense conversation with an investor who looked far less confident about keeping his money in Laurentech. Marco was nearby, his usual smug expression replaced with barely concealed anxiety, a drink clenched in his hand like it was the only thing keeping him from breaking apart. Felix was scanning the room, eyes sharp, predatory, looking for the ghost haunting their lives. And I was standing right in front of them. The thrill of it was intoxicating, to stand so close, to hear their voices, to see their desperation firsthand. They had spent 5 years trying to erase me. Now, I was back, and they had no idea. I took a slow sip of champagne, allowing myself a small, satisfied smile. This was only the beginning. The walls of Laurentech were no longer made of steel and glass. They were made of cracks deep and widening, splitting through the very foundation of the empire my family had spent decades building. The financial leaks had turned into full-blown hemorrhaging, their carefully constructed web of secrets unraveling faster than they could contain. The government was investigating, the media was circling, their competitors were salivating at the chance to devour them whole. And the best part? They still didn't know it was me. They suspected, of course. They had to. And somewhere in the back of their minds, buried beneath the fear and desperation, they must have wondered if their dead daughter, dead sister, dead rival had somehow managed to come back. They had erased me from their files, wiped my name from their systems, burned every last trace of my existence. But ghosts don't stay buried. Now, they were searching, desperately. Laurentech had always operated like a fortress, its walls impenetrable, its leaders untouchable. But not anymore. The stock market had turned against them, their once loyal allies jumping ship, taking their money with them. Contracts were being pulled, projects canceled, partnerships dissolved faster than they could issue reassurances. And their real enemies? The ones they had wronged, cheated, stolen from over the years? They were closing in like wolves. A European conglomerate was pushing to buy out a massive chunk of Laurentech's shares, looking to strip them for parts and absorb their most valuable divisions. A Chinese tech firm had launched a direct lawsuit accusing them of industrial espionage and patent theft. The U.S. Senate had opened a formal inquiry, bringing their most classified AI research under scrutiny. And then there were the underworld connections, the dangerous deals they had made with the kind of people who don't take betrayal lightly. My father had promised technology to people who didn't accept failure. And now that those promises were crumbling, those people wanted blood. Laurentec's enemies weren't just business competitors anymore. They were killers. I watched it all unfold from the inside, slipping in and out of their servers, tapping into their private conversations, their encrypted calls, their frantic late-night meetings where my father, my brothers, and their board of directors fought like cornered animals, grasping for solutions that didn't exist. Because I had made sure of it. When people are drowning, they don't reach for logic. They reach for anything that might save them, no matter how impossible. And so when they had exhausted every strategy, every connection, every last desperate attempt to control the damage, my family finally turned to the one thing they had refused to acknowledge for years: me. It started as a quiet suggestion in one of their high-level meetings, an almost hesitant question spoken aloud as if testing its validity. Did we ever? Marco started, stopping himself before the thought fully formed. He hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face before trying again. Did we ever finish reviewing Rory's final projects before the accident? There was silence. I watched through the boardroom security cameras, the live feed filtering into my system like a front row seat to their unraveling. My father was the first to dismiss it. He waved a hand, expression locked in that same cold indifference he had perfected over the years. Her work was archived. Anything valuable was absorbed by R&D years ago. But did we ever really look? Felix asked. He had been silent for most of the meeting, leaning back in his chair, his usual ruthless confidence missing for once. His jaw was tight, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the tabletop. Because if there's anything, we could use right now, we need to find it. Even if it's old data, Marco agreed. We need everything. We can't afford to ignore any possibility. A possibility, they weren't sure yet, but they were starting to wonder. And that was exactly what I wanted. It didn't take long before they were digging. Felix led the charge, personally overseeing the reopening of my research archives, sifting through every last file, every last encrypted note, every last whisper of data I had left behind. And then finally, they found it. Project Nyx. My father stared at the classified files as if they were a message from beyond the grave, his expression unreadable. He remembered. I could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers clenched the edge of the table. He had known about Nyx, even back then, but he had never understood it. Was this what she was working on before? Marco started, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. Felix barely glanced up from the screens. Yes, they had the files, the research, the blueprints. But it wouldn't be enough, because I had taken the most important piece of it with me. Me? They had no idea that Project Nyx hadn't died with me, that it had worked, that it had brought me back. And now, they wanted to use it. I listened as they talked, their voices slipping between hesitation and intrigue, skepticism and desperate hope. If Nyx had been completed, if there was any way to recreate what I had been building, could it save them? Could they use my own work to pull themselves back from the edge? The irony burned. They only cared now because they needed me. It was almost laughable watching them pretend to care, watching them speak about what I had meant to the company, what I had meant to them, as if they had ever valued me as more than a tool. My father, so composed, so detached, sat in that boardroom, his fingers steepled together, and said, "She was brilliant, too brilliant. We should have handled things differently." Handled, not protected, not saved, not loved. Handled, as if I had been an inconvenience, a business problem that could have been solved with the right PR spin. My fingers curled into fists as I listened to their half-hearted attempts at remorse, their shallow, insincere reflections on what they could have done differently. Marco leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. If she were here, she'd know what to do. Felix's expression was unreadable. If she were here, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. My father was silent for a long time before he finally exhaled, slow and measured. Then maybe we should find out if she left anything else behind. There it was, the first real step toward realizing the truth. They were searching for me now, digging through my work, my research, my digital footprint, hoping to find something, anything that might save them. And that was when I made my decision. I was done waiting. They wanted to see if I had left something behind? Fine, I'd let them find me. But I'd make sure that when they did, they'd wish they never had. The boardroom smelled like money and fear. It was a grand space, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the crumbling empire my family had built. The long polished table reflected the tense, hollow-eyed men seated around it. My father, my brothers, the surviving members of the executive board, all of them locked in a downward spiral they could no longer control. The air was thick with unspoken desperation, the scent of cologne and sweat mixing in the sterile cold of corporate detachment. For the first time in their lives, they were losing Dot, and I was about to make sure they never recovered. I had watched them scramble for weeks, seen the cracks in their carefully curated power widen into unfixable fractures. They were reaching, clawing for anything to keep themselves from slipping further, drowning in a mess of their own making. But today, I wasn't just a ghost in their systems, wasn't just the invisible hand tipping them further into the abyss. Today I was here. I walked through the glass doors, my heels clicking against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the muted conversations like a gunshot. The effect was instantaneous. Every voice in the room stopped. Every movement froze. Eyes widened, faces paled, shock slammed into them like a physical force. Marco made a strangled sound in the back of his throat, knocking over a glass of water as he lurched to his feet. Felix, who had been flipping through a document just moments ago, went completely still, his fingers tightening around the paper as if trying to ground himself in reality. The executives, the men who had known me since I was young, who had watched me build the very systems that ran this company, stared in a kind of stunned horror, their polished exteriors cracking in real time. And my father? His reaction was the most satisfying of all. Lorenzo Sr., the great and untouchable patriarch of this empire, looked like he had been punched in the stomach. His jaw went tight, his hands clenched against the table, and for the first time in my life, I saw something almost like fear flicker across his face. I let the silence stretch, let them look at me, let them process the impossible truth standing in front of them. Because I was impossible. 5 years had passed since they had killed me, since they had staged my fiery accident, wiped me from existence, erased me from their ledgers, like I had been nothing more than a bad investment. But I was here, and I looked exactly as I had the night I died. Same dark hair, same sharp features, same knowing eyes staring back at them with the kind of cold amusement that sent a shiver down their spines. I tilted my head slightly, watching them struggle to understand. Marco was the first to break. This isn't real, he whispered, stepping back like I was something unnatural, something he didn't quite dare to touch. His face was pale, his usual arrogant bravado nowhere to be found. This is some kind of deep fake? Felix, tell me this is a deep fake? Felix didn't answer. His sharp, calculating eyes were locked onto mine, flicking over every detail of my face, my posture, my presence, searching for the trick, the flaw, the thing that would make this make sense. But there was no flaw. I was real, and they knew it. "Hello, boys," I said, my voice smooth, unbothered. The same voice they had heard for 26 years before they had burned me alive. Marco flinched. Felix's fingers twitched. I turned my gaze to my father, the man who had ordered my death like it had been nothing more than a boardroom decision. He hadn't spoken yet, hadn't moved, hadn't done anything but stare at me with that unreadable expression of his. That was fine. I took a step forward, slow, deliberate, letting the tension in the room suffocate them. "You killed me," I said softly. The words weren't accusatory. They weren't angry Dot. They were fact, and my father, the man who had built a global empire on power and control, had no response. The panic set in slowly, creeping in like a slow-moving virus, unraveling the carefully constructed control they had always wielded over this room. I watched the shift happen, watched the moment shock turned into terror, then terror into something worse, desperation, because they needed me. They had already come to that conclusion before they knew I was alive. Now, with me standing in front of them, very much real, very much undeniable. Their last chance at salvation was staring them in the face. Felix was the first to move, stepping forward, his usual cold smirk nowhere to be found. Rory, he said carefully, cautiously. We, this? He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. How? I let my lips curl into something resembling a smile. You really thought you could kill me that easily? He exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly, assessing. No, he admitted. I just didn't expect you to come back. Marco was still shaking his head, muttering something to himself, his mind desperately trying to catch up. This is crazy, he said, voice too high, his breath coming in uneven spurts. You can't be. You're not. Enough! The room fell silent. My father had spoken. He straightened in his chair, his expression shifting back into something controlled, unreadable, dangerous. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the cold calculation that had always made him the most ruthless man in the room. Rory, he said smoothly, as if we were simply picking up after an extended leave of absence. His voice was low, carefully measured. You've been watching? It wasn't a question. I smiled. Yes. And you've seen what's happening to this company? Yes. His jaw flexed, a muscle twitching just slightly. We need you. There it was. The confession. The desperation barely hidden beneath that carefully cultivated mask of control. They had tried to kill me. Now they wanted me to save them. I took my time responding, letting the weight of my silence sink into the air, letting them sit in their own discomfort. Then, slowly, I moved toward the head of the table, the place that had always belonged to my father. I walked around him, dragging my fingers across the polished surface, feeling the room tilt toward me, the power balance shifting with every step I took. You need me, I repeated, rolling the words over my tongue like I was tasting them. He inclined his head slightly, his sharp, piercing gaze locked onto mine. Yes. I exhaled through my nose, amused. That's funny, because 5 years ago I needed you, and you let me burn. Marco looked away. Felix stayed still. My father didn't so much as blink. I rested my hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, letting them see me up close, letting them really look at what they had done. Here's the thing, I said, voice calm, unhurried. I have a choice. I let that sit for a moment, watch the tension coil tighter. I can let you burn, I continued, or I can save you. I tilted my head. What do you think I'm going to do? The room was silent. No one moved. Because for the first time in their lives, they weren't the ones in control. The silence in the boardroom stretched, thick and suffocating, a void where power had once resided. My father, my brothers, the executives who had spent their entire careers bending the world to their will now sat in absolute stillness, waiting. For the first time in their lives, they had no control over the outcome. No plan, no influence, no quick fix. Because I was the one holding all the cards now. I let the weight of my words settle. Let them truly understand that I had the power to erase them, the same way they had once erased me. I could destroy them, burn Laurente to the ground, salt the earth where it once stood, and never look back. It would be easy, satisfying even. And yet, I had spent 5 years thinking about this moment, about revenge and what it would feel like to see them broken, desperate, powerless. I had imagined watching them crumble, imagined walking away while their world collapsed around them. But as I looked around the room, at my father's clenched jaw, at Marco's shallow, panicked breathing, at Felix's unreadable expression, I realized something I hadn't accounted for. Revenge was easy. Revenge was temporary. If I destroyed them, someone else would rise from the ashes, another corporation, another greedy hand reaching for control, another powerful elite eager to fill the void. Nothing would change. The world would continue its cycle, its endless churn of corruption, power, and destruction. But if I took Laurentech from them, if I rebuilt it in my own image, if I made it something they could have never dreamed of, that would be a fate far worse than death. They would be forced to watch as I succeeded where they had failed, forced to witness what true power looked like, forced to understand that I had always been more than just their discarded daughter. I wasn't going to destroy Laurentech. I was going to own it. I straightened, the tension in the room crackling like static electricity as I pulled back from the table, stepping away from my father's looming shadow. "You don't deserve to be saved," I said finally, my voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "But I'm not doing this for you." Felix's fingers twitched, his mask of indifference slipping just slightly. "Then what are you doing it for?" I let my lips curve into a small, knowing smile. "For me." Then, without waiting for a response, I walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering skyline, the empire they had built with blood and betrayal, the empire that now belonged to me. I gave them 24 hours to turn over their shares, 24 hours to step down, sign over their control, and relinquish the empire they had spent their lives building. There was no negotiation, no plea, no deal, no room for them to maneuver their way out. I had already made sure of that. By the time they left the boardroom, the government investigations into their crimes were already locked in place, the leaked financial records too damning to be covered up, the black market deals exposed beyond repair. They could either hand over the company willingly or watch as they were dragged through courts, stripped of their wealth, and left to rot in prison. They chose self-preservation. Of course they did. Marco signed first, hands trembling as he put his name on the dotted line. He was the weakest, the most terrified of losing everything, the one who had never truly been built for the world they lived in. He didn't even try to argue. He knew it was over. Felix was last. Unlike Marco, he wasn't afraid. He was angry. "You think you're different?" he asked as he scrawled his signature on the contract, his sharp gaze cutting into mine. "You think you can run this place without becoming exactly like us?" I didn't blink. "I don't think." "I know." He scoffed, shaking his head, but there was something else behind his frustration, something that looked almost like respect. "You're colder than I gave you credit for," he murmured. "Maybe you really can pull it off." I smiled. "I already have." My father said nothing. He simply handed over the final document, eyes dark, expression unreadable. He had always been the hardest to shake, the most calculating, the one who played the longest game. Even now, even as he signed away his empire, I could tell he was already thinking of his next move. But there wouldn't be one, because he was no longer in the game. And I was. Laurentech was mine. But that didn't mean it was clean. The company had been built on corruption, greed, and unethical AI development. And even with my family gone, there were still snakes in the ranks, men who had spent their careers profiting off the system my father had created. So I burned out the rot. I purged the board, eliminating anyone who had been complicit in the illegal deals, in the backdoor transactions, in the AI sales that had led to wars, destruction, and death. I rebuilt the executive team from the ground up, bringing in minds that believed in innovation without compromise, intelligence without exploitation. I rewrote the mission. No more AI warfare, no more government contracts that blurred the lines of morality, no more corporate backstabbing disguised as progress. Laurentech would become something different, something better, and no one would ever be able to take it from me again. My father was waiting for me on the night of his departure. I wasn't surprised. The penthouse was nearly empty now, stripped of the power and influence that had once made it the most formidable office in the city. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the empire he no longer owned. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. He didn't turn. "You won." I did. A long pause. "You could have burned it down," he said finally. "You could have let it fall, walked away, let your revenge be the only legacy you left behind." I exhaled slowly, stepping beside him, looking out at the skyline. "And what would that have changed?" I asked. "If I had burned it, someone else would have taken its place. The world would go on, just as corrupt, just as broken." I turned to him. "But now I get to decide what it becomes." A small, bitter smile tugged at his lips. "And what is that?" "Something you never could have built," I said simply. For the first time in my life, he looked at me not as his daughter, not as a mistake, not as something he could control. He looked at me as his successor, the true heir of the empire, the one who had won. He nodded once, accepting the truth neither of us needed to speak. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the elevator, leaving the company, leaving my life. And I let him go. In the months that followed, I watched as everything changed. The AI division shifted toward ethical innovation, security systems built to protect, not destroy, technology designed to uplift rather than exploit. There were still challenges, still enemies waiting for me to fail, still old ghosts lurking in the corners of the industry, waiting for their chance to reclaim what they had lost. But I wasn't afraid, because I had already died once, and I had come back stronger. Laurentech belonged to me now, and for the first time in its existence, it finally had a future worth believing in.